the great thing about Australia is the fact that when we wake up every morning, we've forgotten what's happened in the past. We've forgotten what's happened the day before. And that's why you get all these people wondering why these First Nations people are so annoyed, you know, because history doesn't matter. And the whole purpose of these little conversations and the videotaping is to acquaint people with forgotten periods of Australian history which have had a significant impact on us as a society and as a nation state. Now tonight I'm going to talk about some people I didn't know about. You know, and I used to think I knew a little bit of Australian history. I'm going to talk about the Canadians and North Americans, United States citizens, who were transported to Australia from North America to New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land as convicts because they were rebels and revolutionaries. So what we need to do is to look at the background, because without background, you've got no idea what was happening. Now, Canada was described as the new France in the 18th century. And when Louis XIV was a little bit short of cash, he sold Louisiana to the United States. And many of the French people who had settled in Louisiana travelled to Canada, right, to be part of that French community in northern Canada. Now in 1756, a little bit before you and I were born, there was a 7-year war between the English, the indigenous Canadian Indians, and the French. Now the English were smart enough to bring the Iroquois nations on board and the Mohawks on board, which were the main tribal groups in that particular areas, on board as their allies, promising them, you know, access to their land and the fact that they could maintain their independence. So the combination of forces of the Native American Indians and the English defeated the French Canadians in 1763. So there was a lot of bad blood because there was a lot of bloodshed, land was taken over, but the peace treaty which was signed allowed the French Canadians to continue their language and, most importantly of all in that period, to continue to be Roman Catholics, because most of the other Canadians were, you know, some type of, you know, Protestants or Church of England. So that's the early background. By 1837, Canada is divided into two sections. There's Lower Canada and Upper Canada. Lower Canada is around Montreal, Upper Canada is around Toronto. And the difference is that Lower Canada is basically populated by small farmers of French origin who continued to speak French, who continued to be Roman Catholics, and who were irked by the fact they were ruled by the English. Not only the English, but the Church of England, which is one of the biggest landholders in Canada, also extracted money from the French Canadian Catholics as part of their tithe arrangements. So there's a lot of bad blood. And in late 1837, the French revolted against the British. It was a very short revolt. It was put down in bloodshed. Those that had been involved in the revolt, their farms were burnt down as punishment, and many died during that battle. At the same time, in Upper Canada, centred around Toronto, the English migrants, because remember, there were never any convicts sent to Canada. It's of non-convict origin. The English migrants were unhappy with the way the wealth had been distributed in Upper Canada and the fact that a lot of people had now access to necessary resources for survival because of an alliance between the Church of England and a landowning class, right? So they revolted within a few days of the Lower Canadians revolting in late 1837. And it was a small revolt, about 500 were involved, in Toronto mainly, and again they were slaughtered because they were using old arms. Most people weren't interested in what they were about, and they were slaughtered. Now the interesting thing is that a number were arrested and charged with high treason. This is in late 1837. And 2 were hung on a street which is called Toyne Street, which is one of the main streets in Toronto, because they were leaders of the rebellion and they didn't escape into the United States. There was a Samuel Lamont and a Peter Matthews. They were both hung as an example, right? Now guess who in March 1838, who was responsible for the hangings, became the new governor of Upper and Lower Canada? Our very own George Arthur of Van Diemen's Land fame, who'd been the governor of Van Diemen's Land between 1825 and 1832. Because you've got to remember that the British Empire used to rotate its leadership groups into various colonies. It was a mechanism by which people, travelled up the scale. And Mr. Arthur was a little bit of a disciplinarian. At the same time, the previous governor, who was Sir John Colborne, used to think of the French as almost subhuman because he was involved in the struggle against Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, and he was one of the main generals who defeated the French. So there's all this bad feeling at the end of 1837. At the same time, going back to 1791, in order to placate the lower Canadians and the upper Canadians, what they did is they set up 2 parliaments. And these parliaments, any decision they made could be overridden by a British aristocracy, by the governor and their supporters. At the same time, this parliament had what we call a property franchise, and only a limited number of people could prevent it. But because the British authorities were continuing to usurp the decisions which were made, this also added to the tension. So you've got the French Canadian struggle, which is a nationalist struggle. You've got the struggle in Upper Canada, where people want more say in Parliament. The fact you've got intransient disciplinarians in charge. Nothing was resolved in 1837. In November 1838, on the 3rd of November 1838, the French Canadians once again rose up against the British. But they were faced with 3 foes: the British Redcoats, the Canadian militias, because there were Canadian militias, and the Iroquois Nation, the 6 warrior group, who were all in coalition to put down the French revolt. The French revolt was put down very quickly. Over 100 people were killed, but more importantly, what happened is it was a policy of the British Redcoats in Canada to burn down the properties of anybody who had been involved in the revolt, which meant that people were homeless, their families were homeless. So, an interesting person, this is where I want to make it a little bit more interesting, called Francois Prieur, was one of the militia leaders in French Canada who was arrested. And there were over 180 people arrested, and 180 were put on trial, and they're all condemned to death, because in January 1838, the British government, believing that revolt was imminent, not in Upper Canada but Lower Canada, created the Lawless Aggression Act, which went through the British Parliament. The Lawless Aggression Act meant that anybody in Upper or Lower Canada who revolted against the government, the British government, will either be executed or transported for life. That was the punishment for revolt in the legislation in 1838. So we've got people like Francois Prieur, who's sentenced to death, and in the next 6 months, of the 108 people that were tried, 10 were executed. They were hung. And George Arthur was the principal, architect of these executions. At the same time, our radical friends in the United States of America, which you think you may find hard to believe, who are what we'll describe as extreme Democrats, wanted to liberate Canada from the British yoke. Notwithstanding that they actually had slavery in the United States, but no slavery in the British Empire because it had been abolished in the mid-1830s, right? And so what we had is these private militias, which were called Hunters Group, which were being formed to liberate Canadians, the Upper Canadians and the Lower Canadians, mainly the Upper Canadians, from the British yoke. So 10 days after the French revolt occurred in Lower Canada, in 3rd November 1838, there was a revolt. These people began to invade, these private militias began to invade parts of Canada. Now, the United States government was very weak at this particular point in time, and citizens' militias were quite strong. Because you've got to remember that in 1812, the British burnt down Washington. And let's not forget that many of our officers in the Rum Corps who were exiled to Canada were actually involved in the pillage of Washington in 1812, right? That's just a little aside. So you've got these extreme Democrats. Now, militias were important citizens' militias were important in the creation of the United States of America, because in 1836 there was a citizens' revolt against the Mexican dictatorship, which resulted in the Mexican forces in 1837 being removed from Texas, what was Texas, because you had this interaction between American immigrants who were trying to grab land and the Mexican dictatorship. So by 1837, the Mexican dictatorship had lost Texas. So there is this precedent that citizens' militias can have an impact on revolutionary movements. And you've got to remember that Texas was an independent country between 1836 to 1845, when the United States government, went to war with the Mexican government, and the Mexican government lost California, and Texas was incorporated into the US of A. So these hunters groups, these citizens' militias that wanted to liberate the Upper Canadians from the yoke of British imperialism, there was this culture that you could change history by having these private citizens' militias who wanted to basically introduce what they described as real democracy in the United States of America. So there were three incursions into Canada in 1838. There was an incursion in June 1838, where a small band went in and they were routed by the Iroquois, the Canadian militias and the British Army. Now, they expected the Canadians to actually flock to their sides, but unfortunately not one Canadian joined the revolt against British tyranny, because they preferred their own tyranny than having US tyranny. So about 20 were arrested in that particular thing. Now, the interesting thing is that the 14 that hadn't been hung, that were arrested in Toronto in 1837, had been exiled to Bermuda. But on their way to Bermuda, and this is fascinating, on their way to Bermuda, what happened is the British Parliament didn't recognise the law, because you couldn't transport a convict from one colony to another. They had to go to London to be processed in the hulks. So when these 14 exiles arrived, and these were the leadership of the 37 revolt in Upper Canada, arrived at Bermuda, the Bermuda officials would not accept them. So they went back to the United States and were freed. Okay, so that's interesting. Now, of the people who are involved in what's called, the Short Hills campaign, which is the June 1838 campaign, 14 were arrested and they were sent to England for processing. Now, the United States government was totally impotent in terms of reining in the militias or actually attacking the British forces in Canada, because they knew it would be the end of their government. So there was another major incursion in June 1838, and that was the biggest incursion at a place called Windmill Point, which you could actually see from the United States side across the St. Lawrence River. So I think about 180, 200 patriots, they used to call themselves patriots, took over the windmill site and took on the British forces, the Canadian militias, and the Iroquois Six Nations group. And again, they fought very well, but obviously they lost. And 108 were arrested, charged with treason, and they were all to be executed. Now, Sir George, or George Arthur, our own Van Diemen's Land's George Arthur, was very keen to carry out these executions. And 10 of the French Canadians were executed, but 19 of the Americans were eventually executed by the British government. There was another incursion in November 1838 by about 20 to 30 people, and that was put down very quickly. So all in all, after the revolts in 1837 and 1838, we had 855 French Canadians who'd been arrested, and we had 885 United States citizens, and some Canadian Americans had been arrested. Now that's a lot of people to execute. So what the British government did is the British government forced George Arthur, told him, you can't execute these people. You need to free as many as possible, because most of them were foot soldiers, and the great majority were freed, but as I said before, a number were kept in prison. 10 of the French Canadians had been executed, 19 of the Americans had been executed. So by the end of 1838, what had happened is, when the 14 from the Short Hills incursion arrived in the hulks to be processed, radicals in the British Parliament challenged the Lawless Aggression Act, but it was found to be, legal, and they were deported to Van Diemen's Land. One, as a sop to the United States government, was pardoned, but 13 was sent to Van Diemen's Land. At the same time, what we saw was that George Arthur and the British government were very concerned about all these prisoners going to the hulks in London, because it would cause consternation among radicals in the British Parliament, who would then use every legal mean possible to secure their release. So in order to resolve that, George Arthur called on his mates in Van Diemen's Land. The new governor of Van Diemen's Land was a bloke called Sir John Franklin. All right, now remember that name. So they cooked up this little scheme that those who were dead, the hardcore they were going to send as convicts to Van Diemen's Land and New South Wales, or Norfolk Island originally. That was the plan. So 58 French Canadian rebels were loaded onto the ship called Buffalo, and 79 American rebels were loaded onto the same ship, but they were kept separate. All right? Now you've got to remember the Americans are full of bravado. They're huntsmen. They're frontier people. They're used to, being their own masters. The French were more servile. They were practicing Catholics. etc., etc. So what happened is the ship Buffalo, to bypass the hulks, went directly from Toronto, Toronto, all the way to Van Diemen's Land with a stopover in Rio de Janeiro to pick up fresh fruit, because of scurvy was a real problem on these trips, right? So what happened when they went to Van Diemen's Land is the 79 Americans were offloaded in Van Diemen's Land. At the same time, 2 or 3 months, this is 1840, 2 or 3 months earlier, the 14 Americans that were in the early Upper Canadian Revolt were also deported to Van Diemen's Land. So you had 79 and 14, what's that? 93. So there were 93 American convicts in Van Diemen's Land. Now there was a problem. Now these were educated people. 8 of the Americans actually wrote journals which were published after they were released and pardoned. And obviously there was this issue of them mixing in with a common criminal, because Van Diemen's Land in those days was a particularly vicious, nasty place. Nasty. And George Arthur set up a system. Remember, it wasn't just the extermination of the Aboriginal people that was occurring between 25 and 37. What you had is this introduction of this system of incarceration, which was basically based on not flogging, although flogging was used, but which was based on psychological torture, psychological torture in terms of keep people solitary confinement, keeping them in darkness, put on funny costumes, and having them masks on constantly. So there was no contact between prisoners. So this new penitentiary, this was considered to be progressive incarceration. All right, flogging was the old way. But unfortunately for the Americans, the 14 that had come before the other 79 were under a different system, because the new reformist government, the Whig government in England, was very concerned that the Bunyip aristocracy in Australia was making a packet out of the free labour which skills were providing. So they changed. So what happened to the first 14? They came to Van Diemen's Land, they were assigned to landowners, their life was quite reasonable. But the other 79, the law had changed that they had to work for the state for 2 years in road gangs and before they could be assigned to private enterprise, right, as free labour. And that was a particularly brutal, vicious time. And although none of the Americans were flogged, flogging was very common. The fact is the work was hard. There was a thing called the caterpillar, the human caterpillar, where you had, all those, remember those nice big tall timbers in Van Diemen's Land? When they were cut down by hand, they had to be hauled out, not with horses, but by human beings. And they'd be in lines with ropes to haul out the timber. Then you had Port Arthur, where you had the dogs. It was a particularly noxious thing. And within 4 years, before they were pardoned, and I'll talk about that in a minute, 11 of the 93 that found themselves in Tasmania had died, mainly through exhaustion, overwork, brutal punishment. Now, when you talk about brutal punishment, most of them were assigned, that those that survived, to quite cushy jobs. I mean, some of them were even in charge of estates, but you had to go through these first 2 years because of the change of legislation. So, the old saying, be careful of what you wish for. And the Whig government wished to have a system of incarceration which didn't enrich the landowners, but that meant that the convicts, especially those with skill, didn't have any mechanism via which to avoid the hard labour, which, when I've spoken before, we've spoken about these, because the squatters soon realised that this was a cheap, useful, productive labour force. Now, 2 of the convicts escaped, and they managed to actually find an American whaling ship. They got to Hobart and escaped that way, 2 of them. But another 2 attempted to escape, a bloke called Linus Miller and another bloke called, I've forgotten his name, I think it was Stewart. They attempted to escape, they were captured, and because they attempted to escape, they were sent to Port Arthur. But the beauty is that Linus Miller left a written account of the punishments which occurred, and it's a brilliant account which you can access, Linus Miller, which you can access possibly online, regarding what they went through. Now, believe it or not, in 1844, 4 years after they'd arrived, they were pardoned, because this was the way the British dealt with rebellion. They would execute the leaders, they would free, after a little bit of incarceration, most of the foot soldiers, and those in between they would transport. And then they would pardon them 4 or 5 years later, because there's possible revolt. Because remember, at the British Empire at its height in India, only had 20,000 troops in India. 20,000 for a population of 700 million. So it was a mechanism by which you had to, give and take. So so of the Americans that were left, so that was 93, 11 died in Van Diemen's Land. That's 81, another 2 died. 1 died on the ship forward, another 2, so 80. Now the interesting thing is, of the 80 that were left, only 65 went back to the United States of America, because they found life here quite well. They formed romantic relationships, had children, and obviously if you were born in Van Diemen's Land, there's a possibility that one of your ancestors could have been a United States rebel or revolutionary. Now, the French Canadians, what happened to them? Well, they were French Canadians, they weren't Americans, they weren't Anglo-Saxons. They were to be sent to Norfolk Island, which had been reopened in 1825. It had been closed. It was such a brutal place, after the Irish revolt at Vinegar Hill in Sydney. It was reopened in 1825. Now, the ship, the Buffalo, pulled into Sydney Harbour first, and the Catholic bishop in New South Wales, which was then under a Governor Burke, and Governor Burke was interesting because he treated all religions equally. Remember before when we spoke about the Irish rebellions, how Catholics were suppressed? At this stage, the British government was treating all religions equally. So the bishop, the Roman Catholic bishop of New South Wales, had been in touch with the Roman Catholic bishops in Lower Canada. Let's not forget, there's all types of imperialism, not just secular imperialism. There's Catholic imperialism, Protestant imperialism, whatever you like to call it. And he had made a case to Governor Burke, who was a relatively liberal man, that these men should not be transported to Norfolk Island. Now, Governor Burke still wanted to transport them to Norfolk Island, but the captain of the Buffalo said he had important cargo to deliver to New Zealand, and he didn't have time to deliver these 58 men to Norfolk Island. Now remember, these 58 French Canadians were then left in Sydney. These were the last convicts who were transported to New South Wales because the people of New South Wales had revolted. They were sick and tired of competing because immigration was occurring, and they were sick and tired of competing with free labour. And there was an anti-transportation league had been set up, which was quite successful. So what do you do with these 58 French, Catholic French Canadians? What do you do with these gentlemen? Well, they sent them off to a Concord in Sydney, where there was a convict station. And there was a gentleman called Mr. Badley, Baddley. Now, there are scoundrels and scoundrels in Australian early history. And there are lovable scoundrels and there are horrible scoundrels. You call the Reverend Samuel Marsden a horrible scoundrel, but Mr. Badley had a bit of an alcohol problem, and he was the superintendent of the prisoners. This was 1841. And he used to get into fights with his own jailers, with the jailers. So on one particular occasion, he got the French Canadians to jail the jailers. And then after that, it became obvious to the French Canadians that he was skimming the profits which would be made by the free convict labour, and he was putting it in his pocket. So what he then did is he made the French Canadians' life quite bearable, because they were almost self-managed and self-sufficient. They set up a candle factory, a bakery. These were commercial ventures. They collected seashells, which they sold to the lime kilns, to make cement. And so, apart from the homesickness, it wasn't a bad life. In 1844, the French Canadians were pardoned. Now, the difference between the French Canadians and the United States convicts is very, is very different. All the French Canadian convicts except one went back to Canada, but there was a problem. You had to pay your passage back. So if you had friends and family in Canada who had wealth, you paid your way back in 1844, and I think 26 went in one ship back at once. But people like Francois Prieur, who wrote a journal about what happened to him, didn't have enough resources, and he was stuck there for a few more years till the company he was working for, which I think was a French company, paid his fare back to Canada. So 58 of the, I think 2 died, so 57 of the 59, 56 of the 59 went back, 2 died, and one, a Mr. Marceau, a widower, found love in Sydney. Married a local lass, moved to Dapto, had 11 children, and guess what? Every few years, the Marceau family in New South Wales has a reunion. Isn't that nice? Isn't that pleasant? Okay. So, I know I'm being facetious, but they wanted to get home because they found life in their journals. They found Sydney life coarse. They couldn't deal with the criminality and the drunkenness and the random violence. It was a little bit different for the United States, which is more of a frontier society, and they were used to this type of behaviour. But these were, French Canadians. They had their own, thing. So, what's interesting about this? It's a nice story, but what impact did they have? Now, the interesting thing is, we all think about the Eureka Revolt on the 3rd of December 1854 as the gateway to parliamentary democracy in Australia. But the British Empire had been fiddling with this concept for the past 20 years. And Upper and Lower Canada was the ground on which they experimented, because they soon learnt that if you give people limited self-government and leave things like defence and foreign relations to the empire, that they won't revolt. And so in 1791, we had the Dominion of Upper and Lower Canada, which both had, as I said before, parliaments, which were elected on the basis of the amount of property you had, if you had a vote or not. Nothing like that existed in Australia, because there were no convicts in Canada, right? They were all immigrants or refugees, from Louisiana, and other people trappers who'd, formed the New France. At the same time, what we saw is the disciplinarian element was being removed, and the type of coercion that was being used was a coercion which was based on psychology, right? People are not going to revolt if they got the basic necessities of life and they've got some independence. So Canada, Upper and Lower Canada, was this experiment. And people like Louis Papineau, who was the radical theorist behind the French Canadian Rebellion, was pardoned and joined the new parliament. And what they did is they joined Upper and Lower Canada and formed one parliament in 1846. And why did they do that? To suppress the French minority, because they understood that if you had one parliament and you had, everybody who could vote, that the English majority would always be in a majority. But they made a mistake, because the English majority was there were two factions. There were the conservatives and the radicals. So the French Canadians they formed alliances with different groups at different times. By 1867, the Upper and Lower Canada had been abolished, and the Dominion of Canada was established. So, a few interesting facts. Remember I mentioned the word Sir John Franklin, the governor of Van Diemen's Land in 1840. Now, when the United States prisoners arrived in Van Diemen's Lands, they were horrified, because guess who the uncle of Sir John Franklin was? Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of the United States of America. So they were horrified that this man could actually be in this position of authority in the British government. They were just horrified. Another interesting fact. I know that facts don't matter in the 21st century, but they didn't matter in the past. But another interesting fact. People like, now those of you interested in the Tunnerminnerwait Maulboyheenner saga will remember the judge who actually presided over the trials was Judge Willis, the judge who some thought to be cracked. Now, Judge Willis had been thrown out of court in Upper Canada because of his disciplinarian activities. And when he got back to England, he secured this post in New South Wales. They found him to be a real nutcase, and they sent him to be the first Supreme Court judge of Melbourne. And Willis Street in Melbourne is named after Judge Willis. So you've got this connection. Then you've got the connection of George Arthur, being the governor of Van Diemen's Land for 13 years, between 1825 and 1838, 25 to 38, and then being governor of Upper and Lower Canada. Another extraordinary coincidence. So what you see, if you look at the history of the British Empire, Captain Cook, he was involved in the skirmishes in North America. So the British Empire had this caste of people who weren't aristocrats, but who were able to ensure that the British Empire continued. Now, impact. So there's impact, impact in terms of the British government was ready for a revolt, whether it occurred in Australia or not. They understood the way to keep the empire intact was to grant limited self-government to countries that revolted. So when Victoria revolted, they had limited self-government. And it's worked, because in 2024 we're still a constitutional monarchy. Same principles, constitutional monarchy. Now, interesting facts. In 1970, remember Prime Minister Trudeau, not the young one, the old bloke. He came to Australia in 1970, the Captain Cook's bicentenary, to unveil a monument which was erected to the French Canadians, which if you go to Sydney you can find in Concord. And if you go to Tasmania, if you go to Sandy Bay or Battery Point, which were two of the major areas where the United States prisoners were, there are also monuments to those too. But if you talk to people today about the North American rebels and the impact they had, and the French Canadians and the impact they had on the way that this colony, and we were a colony, progressed, most people would have no inclination. Most people think it all started in 1854. It didn't start in 1854, when the Whig government was won in 1832 and introduced all these reforms which we've spoken about in the past. What it did is it changed the way they dealt with revolt and revolution, because they understood they didn't actually have the manpower to put down every revolt. The loss of the American colonies in 1776 taught them that you cannot continue to use force to oppress people, something the Israeli state hasn't understood in 2024. You can succeed for a period of time by being authoritarian and through atrocities, but all that does is create more hatred and more resistance. So the way you resolve that issue is by giving populations that are revolting for a variety number of reasons more freedoms. Now I'm going to ask you a trick question, and you can look it up on your search engine. I refuse to use that name of that company. There is a part of Canada that's still part of France. It's a little island, I think off Newfoundland, and it's got about 6,000 people. Do you know what it is? Oscar will find out. Now, let's move forward. Oh yeah. Remember, history progresses, irrespective of whether we remember it or not. Those of you who are old enough to remember the Quebec Liberation Front in the 1960s and the 1970s, the QLF. Remember all the kerfuffle in Quebec in the late 60s, early 70s, where you had this particular group which was using violence to promote the idea of Quebecian independence. This is all related right back to the mid-18th century, when France, was the dominant European power in the Canadian provinces. So you've got the revolt, which was they lost against the British. Then you've got this continuum. You've got the revolt of the French Canadians in 1837, the revolt in 1838. Then you've got the compromises which were made, which allowed them to keep their language and their culture intact. So if you go to Canada today, you'll notice the difference. If you go to Montreal and you go to Toronto, you will notice the difference. And it's a significant difference which is based on the fact that these revolts which occurred have continued to have an impact on current society. Because if you didn't have the American Patriots, the private militias, invading Canada in the 1838, you wouldn't have that push by the British Empire to give more freedoms to the Canadian people and to allow assemblies to be created which were based initially on property franchises, then on universal male suffrage. Now, some other interesting stories. Remember I spoke about this nice gentleman, Mr. Francois Prieur, spent time as a convict in Australia, one of the French Canadians, had trouble getting home, eventually got home. Guess what happened in 1876? He was appointed the superintendent of Canada's prisons. How life changes. And that's the difference. See, that's the difference between today, where you're cursed for all eternity if you say the wrong word, and what happened during that period. People were able to be rehabilitated and re-entered society. The French radical who was responsible for the original revolt, Louis Papineau, as I said, was pardoned by Queen Victoria in 1848 and became an important member of the Legislative Assembly in the Joint Parliament. You had Dr. Nelson, who was the leader, believe it or not, the leader of the French Canadians, returned. They all returned. They were all pardoned. That's right, St. Pierre Miquelon. Thank you, our fact checker. And if you ever go to Canada and you want a good croissant, I recommend you go to those islands. French dependencies on the border, and that would have been a compromise. So history is important because it's a continuum. We are what we are because of what's happened. And we will be what we will be in the future because of what we're doing today. And that's what people need to understand. The past is fundamental not only to the understanding of who we are, but understanding of how to move forward, because it does have an impact whether we acknowledge it or not. So all I can say is I'd like to thank you for coming tonight. Hopefully it's put a few thoughts in your head, and I'm open for questions.